Her sisters laughed at her torn dress until the Duke called her the only woman who ever stunned me. The laughter cut deeper than the rip itself. Eliza Hartwell stood frozen in the grand foyer of Ashford Manor, her mother's silk gown, the only fine thing she owned, torn from waist to hem, exposing her patched petticoat and the shame she'd spent years concealing. Her sisters, Celestine and Margaret, clutched each other in theatrical delight, their pearl-adorned necks thrown back as they shrieked with mirth. "Look at her," Celestine gasped between giggles. "The charity case finally shows her true colors." But it was the silence that followed that shattered her. The moment when every eye in the receiving line turned toward her, when 300 guests of the season's most exclusive ball witnessed her humiliation. And then, cutting through the cruel quiet like a blade through water, came a voice she'd only heard in whispers. "Madam, you are the only woman who ever stunned me." The Duke of Ravencross stood at the top of the marble staircase, his obsidian eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the room disappear. Wait, before the next confession unfolds. If this story has already stirred your heart, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss the next betrayal, kiss, or redemption, subscribe and join our circle. The next heartbeat might change everything. Now, back to the scene. The ballroom held its breath. Eliza's hands trembled as she tried to gather the torn fabric, but it was useless. The damage was complete, the humiliation absolute. She could feel the weight of 300 stares, could hear the whispered speculation already beginning to ripple through the crowd like poison in water. "Your Grace," Lady Ashford stuttered, her face pale as she attempted a curtsy. The hostess clearly hadn't expected the Duke of Ravencross to arrive at all, let alone to speak his first words in defense of a nobody. The Duke descended the staircase with the unhurried grace of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. He was taller than the rumors suggested, with sharp cheekbones that caught the candlelight and hair as black as a raven's wing. His evening coat was perfectly tailored, his cravat an immaculate waterfall of white silk. But it was his eyes that held Eliza captive, dark, penetrating, ancient somehow, as if they'd witnessed centuries rather than the mere 30 years his face suggested. "Lady Ashford," he said without breaking his gaze from Eliza, "I believe you've neglected to introduce me to your most interesting guest." "Your Grace, that is to say—" Lady Ashford floundered, caught between social obligation and the obvious desire to dismiss Eliza entirely. "This is Miss Eliza Hartwell, the daughter of my late cousin. She's here as a companion to my daughters." The word companion landed like a stone. Not a guest, not an equal, a charity case, just as Celestine had said. Eliza forced herself to meet the Duke's gaze. If she was to be humiliated, she would at least face it with whatever dignity she had left. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I apologize for the disturbance. If you'll excuse me." "I will not." His words were soft but absolute. "The disturbance, Miss Hartwell, is not yours." He turned to face the assembled crowd, and Eliza watched in astonishment as 300 people seemed to collectively shrink under his regard. I find it curious that a room full of England's finest cannot tell the difference between grace and gilding. Miss Hartwell stands before you with a torn gown and more dignity than this entire assembly possesses in their combined wardrobes. Celestine made a choking sound. Margaret had gone deathly pale. "Your Grace," Lord Pemberton stepped forward, his round face flushed with wine and indignation. "Surely you cannot mean to suggest—" "I suggest nothing, Pemberton. I state facts." The Duke's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "And the fact is this.
I came to this tedious affair for one purpose only, to find a woman of substance rather than show. I believe I've succeeded." He extended his gloved hand toward Eliza. "Miss Hartwell, would you do me the honor of the first waltz?" The room erupted in whispers. Eliza stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a serpent. This had to be some elaborate joke, another layer of humiliation designed to crush her completely. Men like the Duke of Ravencross didn't dance with penniless relations in torn gowns. They certainly didn't defend them before the entire ton. "I don't understand," she whispered. Something flickered in those dark eyes. Was it amusement? Sympathy? "Neither do I, Miss Hartwell. But I find that the most interesting things in life rarely make sense at first encounter." His hand remained extended, steady, waiting. "Will you trust me for the length of one dance?" Behind her, she heard Lady Ashford's sharp intake of breath, the beginning of a protest. She heard Celestine hiss something venomous to Margaret. She felt the weight of every judgmental eye in the ballroom. And then, with a recklessness that surprised even herself, Eliza placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with surprising warmth. The glove between them did nothing to diminish the shock of contact, like touching a live wire, like placing her palm against winter lightning. "Brave girl," he murmured, so quietly that only she could hear. He led her past her gaping sisters, past the slack-jawed Lord Pemberton, past Lady Ashford's furious glare. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, and Eliza felt herself moving through a dream, a nightmare, she couldn't tell, toward the center of the polished ballroom floor. The orchestra, which had fallen silent during the confrontation, now scrambled to attention. The conductor looked to the Duke, who gave a subtle nod.
The opening strains of a waltz filled the air. "Your Grace," Eliza said as he positioned them for the dance, his hand settling at her waist with perfect propriety, "why are you doing this? Would you believe me if I said I don't entirely know?" His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I came to London 3 days ago, after 5 years abroad. I've been to every tedious ball, every insipid dinner party, every mind-numbing opera box. I've met diamond after diamond of the first water, each one more accomplished and more dull than the last." He swept her into the first turn, and despite her torn dress, despite her confusion, Eliza found herself moving with him as if they danced together 1,000 times. "And then," he continued, his voice low and intimate despite the watching crowd, "I walk into this ballroom and see a young woman standing in ruined silk, facing down the contempt of her supposed betters with her head held high. Do you know what I saw in that moment, Miss Hartwell?" She couldn't speak, could barely breathe. I saw someone real. They spun past a cluster of debutantes, each one shooting daggers with their eyes. Eliza caught a glimpse of Celestine's face, red with fury, twisted with jealousy, and felt a small, guilty spark of satisfaction. "You don't know me," Eliza managed. "I could be anything, anyone." "Could you?" He tilted his head, studying her as they moved through the dance. "Could you be cruel? Could you be false? Could you laugh at another's misfortune for your own amusement?" His eyes flicked briefly toward where her sister stood, making his point without words. "No, Miss Hartwell, I don't think you could." "How can you possibly know that?" "Because," he said simply, "I've spent 5 years studying the worst that humanity has to offer. I've seen cruelty masked as courtesy, greed disguised as generosity, and contempt dressed up as compassion. After a time, you learn to recognize the absence of these things. You shine with it. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry. Not here. Not now. You speak as if you've seen terrible things. Something dark passed across his features. I have. The music swelled around them, and for a moment they simply danced. Eliza became aware of the whispers intensifying at the edges of the ballroom, of the shocked faces tracking their every movement. The Duke of Ravenscross, the most eligible bachelor in England, was waltzing with a nobody in a torn dress. It was social suicide for both of them. "Your Grace," she said urgently, "people are talking. This will damage your reputation." "My reputation?" he said with cold amusement, "is already quite thoroughly damaged, I assure you. The Ton has spent 5 years speculating about where I've been and what I've done. Let them add this to their list of scandals. But I have nothing. I am nothing. If you're seen showing me favor, you will what? Be gossiped about? My dear Miss Hartwell, they're already gossiping about you. At least this way, you're the woman who captured the attention of a duke rather than simply the one with the torn dress." The logic was sound, but Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that she was being swept into something far larger and more complicated than a simple waltz. "What do you want from me?" The directness of the question seemed to surprise him. The corner of his mouth lifted in genuine amusement. "You don't mince words, do you?" "I can't afford to. Life has not given me the luxury of pretense." "No," he agreed, his expression growing serious. "I imagine it hasn't." He was quiet for a long moment, guiding her through a complex turn that should have been beyond her ability, but somehow wasn't. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made her breath catch. "I want to propose something highly irregular, Miss Hartwell, but I cannot do so here, in front of 300 witnesses." "Will you meet me tomorrow in Hyde Park? The Serpentine, at noon?" "That would be incredibly improper." "Yes. I would need a chaperone." "Bring one. Bring 6. I don't care." His grip on her hand tightened almost imperceptibly. "What I have to propose requires privacy and honesty, both of which are impossible in this gilded cage." The music was drawing to a close. In moments, the dance would end and Eliza would be returned to her place, whatever that place was now, forever altered by this impossible encounter. "Why me?" she whispered. "Truly, why me?" The Duke of Ravenscross looked at her with those ancient, knowing eyes, and for just a moment she thought she saw something break in his expression, some carefully maintained mask slipping to reveal a bottomless weariness beneath. "Because," he said quietly, as the final notes of the waltz faded into silence, "I am in desperate need of someone who cannot be bought, cannot be flattered, and cannot be fooled. And in 5 years of searching, you are the first person I've met who fits that description." The music ended. He bowed over her hand with perfect formality, his lips not quite touching her glove. When he straightened, his expression had returned to its previous impenetrable coolness. "Tomorrow," he said, "noon, the Serpentine." And then he was gone, striding through the crowd with the same commanding presence that had announced his arrival. The assembled guests scattered before him like startled birds. Eliza stood alone in the center of the ballroom, her torn dress forgotten, her mind reeling. Around her, the whispers crescendoed into a roar. Lady Ashford materialized at her elbow, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. "What did you do?" she hissed. "What did you say to him?" I didn't. This is a disaster, an absolute disaster. The Duke of Ravenscross, dancing with you, defending you?" She pressed her fingers to her temples as if warding off a headache. Celestine was supposed to catch his attention. Margaret was meant to... She stopped, collecting herself with visible effort. "Go to your room, now. We will discuss this in the morning." Eliza didn't need to be told twice. She gathered her ruined skirts and fled the ballroom, feeling the weight of every stare following her retreat. She could hear Celestine's furious whispers, Margaret's shocked titters, the endless speculation of 300 gossip-hungry guests. But beneath the humiliation and confusion, beneath the terror of what she might have just unleashed, she felt something else entirely: hope. The servants' quarters where Eliza slept were tucked into the coldest corner of Ashford Manor, 3 flights up and half a world away from the luxurious chambers where her cousins resided. The room was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a small trunk, with a window so drafty that frost formed on the inside of the glass even in September. She sat on the bed, still wearing the torn dress, unable to summon the energy to undress. Her hands were shaking, from cold, from shock, from the lingering sensation of the Duke's hand at her waist. What just happened? A knock at the door made her jump. "Miss." It was Betty, one of the kitchen maids and the closest thing Eliza had to a friend in this house. She slipped inside, her round face creased with concern and barely contained excitement. "Miss, everyone's talking about what happened. Is it true? Did the Duke really dance with you?" "Yes." Eliza's voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and dreamlike. "And did he really say you were the only woman who ever stunned him?" "He did." Betty clutched her chest dramatically. Lord above, it's like something from one of them novels. The handsome Duke, the poor but virtuous maiden? Betty, this isn't a novel. This is... Eliza trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. This is... complicated.
Complicated? How? Betty settled herself on the floor, clearly prepared for a long conversation. He's rich as Croesus, handsome as sin, and he just publicly declared his interest in you in front of half the ton. Seems pretty straightforward to me. You don't understand. Men like the Duke of Ravencross don't marry women like me. They don't even notice women like me, not unless they want something. And what if what he wants is you? Eliza shook her head. He wants something else. He said he has a proposition for me. He wants to meet tomorrow in Hyde Park. Betty's eyes went wide. Are you going to go? I don't know. I should refuse. I should stay as far away from him as possible. Even as she said it, Eliza knew she was lying to herself. She was going to go. Of course she was going to go. How could she not? What if it's some kind of cruel joke? What if he's no better than Celestine and Margaret, just more subtle about his cruelty? Did he seem cruel to you? Eliza thought back to the way he'd looked at her, the quiet intensity in his voice when he'd called her real. No, she admitted. He seemed sad, tired, as if he'd seen too much of the world and found it wanting. Well then, Betty stood, brushing off her skirts. Seems to me you've got nothing to lose by hearing what he has to say. It's not like things can get much worse for you here, can they? She had a point. After tonight's spectacle, Lady Ashford would likely find some excuse to send Eliza away anyway. At least meeting with the Duke might provide answers to the questions that were already driving her mad. After Betty left, Eliza finally changed out of the ruined dress, folding it carefully despite its condition. It had been her mother's, one of the last tangible connections to the woman who died when Eliza was 12, leaving her to the tender mercies of distant relations who viewed her as an obligation at best and a burden at worst. She lay in bed as the house slowly quieted around her, listening to the distant sounds of the ball winding down, carriage wheels on gravel, laughter growing progressively drunker, the slam of doors as her cousins finally retired to their rooms, no doubt furious at how the evening had concluded. Tomorrow she would go to Hyde Park. She would hear what the Duke of Ravencross had to say.
And then, well, then she would deal with whatever came next. For tonight, she allowed herself to remember the feel of his hand in hers, the way he'd looked at her as if she were something precious rather than disposable. It was probably foolish. It was certainly dangerous. But it was the first time in years that anyone had made her feel like she mattered. Eliza woke to the sound of shouting. She bolted upright, her heart hammering, as angry voices echoed through the house. One was Lady Ashford's, shrill, furious. The other was male, deeper, aristocratic. The Duke? No. As Eliza crept to her door and eased it open, she recognized the voice of Lady Ashford's brother, Lord Marcus Fairfax, a pompous man who'd inherited his title and fortune through the timely death of a cousin and never let anyone forget his elevated status. Absolute disaster, Constance. Do you have any idea what you've done? The girl is nobody, less than nobody, and you've allowed the Duke of Ravencross to make a public spectacle over her. I didn't allow anything. Lady Ashford's voice was sharp with panic. How was I supposed to stop him? He's a duke, Marcus. One doesn't simply tell a duke what to do. You should have managed the situation better. Celestine should have been the one in that ballroom. She's beautiful, accomplished, perfectly positioned to… Celestine is a fool who can't hold a man's attention for longer than it takes him to look at her face. The Duke isn't interested in pretty baubles. He made that abundantly clear. Footsteps paced across what sounded like the morning room.
Lord Marcus's voice dropped lower, but Eliza could still make out his words. There are rumors, Constance, terrible rumors about where Ravencross has been these last 5 years, about what he's done. Some say he was on the continent during the worst of the wars. Others claim he was further east, in places no gentleman should venture. And there are whispers, very quiet whispers, about why he left England in the first place. Rumors and whispers are the currency of the ton, Marcus. They mean nothing, don't they? Then tell me this. Why would one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in England suddenly appear at a second-rate ball and dance with a penniless orphan? Why would he defend her so publicly? What possible interest could he have in a girl like Eliza Hartwell? There was a long pause. When Lady Ashford spoke again, her voice carried a calculating edge. Perhaps we've been thinking about this all wrong. What do you mean? If the Duke wants the girl, then the girl has suddenly become valuable. Very valuable indeed. We're her family, Marcus, her guardians. Surely that position comes with certain considerations. Eliza felt sick. You mean to sell her to him? It wasn't a question. I mean to facilitate a mutually beneficial arrangement. If Ravencross wants Eliza for whatever purposes he has in mind, then we should be compensated for the loss of her companionship. And if he's willing to marry her, which seems unlikely but not impossible, then we should negotiate for Celestine and Margaret to be included in the connections such an alliance would bring. And if the girl refuses? Lady Ashford laughed, cold and sharp. The girl has nothing. She is nothing. She'll do what she's told, or she'll find herself out on the street without a reference. Now I must prepare for the morning calls. Half of London will be at our door by noon, and I intend to control the narrative of last night's events. Eliza didn't wait to hear more.
She closed her door as quietly as possible and leaned against it, her mind racing. She'd been a fool to hope. The Duke's interest, whatever its source, had only made her situation worse. Now she wasn't just a burden to be tolerated, she was a commodity to be traded. The image of her mother's face swam before her eyes. Sarah Hartwell had been a beauty in her day, or so the stories went. until she'd made the mistake of marrying for love rather than position. When her husband died penniless, she'd been forced to rely on the charity of relations who'd never forgiven her for marrying beneath her station, the same relations who now had custody of her daughter. "I won't be sold," Eliza whispered to the empty room. "I won't." But what choice did she have? Where could she go? She had no money, no connections, no skills beyond basic literacy and needlework. Running away would mean starvation or worse. Unless the Duke's proposition. Whatever it was, whatever he wanted, it couldn't be worse than being auctioned off to the highest bidder by Lady Ashford. At least with the Duke, she might have some small measure of choice in her own fate. She dressed quickly in her most modest day dress, a faded blue cotton that had been turned twice to hide the worst of the wear. She had no proper outdoor clothing, no pelisse or spencer, just a thin shawl that did nothing against the autumn chill. But it would have to do. The question was how to get out of the house without Lady Ashford seeing her. The front door was out of the question, but the servants' entrance? Betty found her in the kitchen, trying to slip out through the scullery. "Where are you going?" she whispered urgently. "Hyde Park, the Duke's meeting." "But it's only 9:30. You've hours yet." "I need to leave now, before Lady Ashford realizes I'm gone. She and Lord Marcus are planning something, Betty, something terrible." Understanding flashed across Betty's round face. "Right, here."
She pulled off her own wool cloak and thrust it at Eliza. "Take this. And here." She pressed a few coins into Eliza's hand, "for a hackney, if you need one, to get away." "I can't take your money." "You can and you will. Now, go, before Cook comes back from the market." Eliza hugged her fiercely, then slipped out into the gray London morning. The streets were already busy with vendors and delivery wagons, the city waking to another day. Eliza pulled Betty's cloak close and walked quickly, keeping her head down. She'd been to Hyde Park before, accompanying her cousins on their tedious promenades, and she knew the way. The Serpentine stretched out before her, gray and choppy under the overcast sky. A few hardy souls were out for morning constitutionals, but the park was largely empty. Eliza found a bench near the water and sat down to wait. What would she say to him? What could she possibly say? "You're early." She jumped at the voice, spinning to find the Duke of Ravencross standing behind her bench. He wore a greatcoat against the cold and carried a walking stick, every inch the gentleman, out for a morning stroll. But his eyes held the same intensity she remembered from the night before. "I needed to leave the house," she said honestly. "Things have become complicated." More complicated than being publicly defended by a duke at the season's most exclusive ball? A hint of amusement colored his words. "Yes, actually." He came around the bench and gestured to the empty space beside her. "May I?" She nodded, and he sat, maintaining a careful distance that was probably proper, but felt oddly lonely after the intimacy of their dance. "Tell me," he said quietly. And so she did. She told him about the conversation she'd overheard, about Lady Ashford's plans to sell her like a piece of furniture. She told him about her mother, about the years of being treated as less than human by people who should have loved her. He listened without interrupting, his dark eyes fixed on her face with complete attention. When she finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Sorry that you've been treated so poorly by those who should have protected you. Sorry that my actions last night have made your situation worse rather than better." "Why did you do it?" The question burst from her before she could stop it. "Why did you defend me? Why did you dance with me? You could have had any woman in that ballroom. I told you last night. You told me poetry. Now I need the truth." He smiled, a real smile that transformed his face from merely handsome to something almost beautiful. "Very well, the truth." He stood and walked to the edge of the Serpentine, staring out at the gray water. 5 years ago, I left England in disgrace.
The details don't matter, but suffice to say I was young, arrogant, and made choices that hurt people I cared about. I went abroad to escape the consequences, and I stayed abroad because I was a coward. You don't seem like a coward. We rarely do, to ourselves. He turned back to face her. I spent those 5 years in places most English gentlemen never see. Constantinople, Cairo, further east still. I learned things about the world, about myself, about the nature of power and cruelty and survival. And when I finally returned to England 3 days ago, I found that nothing had changed. The same people, the same games, the same casual cruelty dressed up as civility. And then you met me, and then I met you. He returned to the bench, sitting closer this time. Miss Hartwell, I'm going to be very direct with you, because I think you deserve that much. I need a wife. Her breath caught. Not for the usual reasons, he continued quickly. I'm not in love with you. I don't even know you, not really. But I need a wife who is strong enough to stand beside me, clever enough to navigate society's treacherous waters, and honest enough to tell me when I'm being a fool. I need someone who can't be bought or intimidated or seduced away from their principles. And in 5 years of searching, you're the first person I've met who fits those requirements. You want to marry me? It came out flat, disbelieving. I want to propose a marriage of convenience, a partnership, if you will. You would have my name, my protection, and my fortune. In exchange, you would help me navigate the social obligations of my position and serve as my partner in certain business matters. What kind of business matters? He hesitated, and she saw the calculation behind his eyes. How much to tell her, how much to trust her. The kind that required discretion, intelligence, and a willingness to see beneath the surface of things. The kind that would benefit from a partner who knows what it's like to be underestimated and overlooked. You're asking me to be a spy. I'm asking you to be my wife. The rest we can discuss as we go. Eliza's head was spinning. This morning, she'd been facing the prospect of being sold off like livestock. Now she was being offered marriage to a duke. It was insane. It was impossible. It was the only real choice she had. I have conditions, she heard herself say. His eyebrows rose. Conditions? If I'm to be your wife, even in name only, then I need certain assurances. First, I will not be locked away in some country estate while you conduct your business. If we're to be partners, then we're partners in truth. Second, I want an allowance of my own, separate from your general accounts, that cannot be taken away regardless of how our marriage fares. Third, if you have a mistress or intend to take one, I'd prefer to know about it up front rather than discovering it through gossip. He stared at her for a long moment, and then he laughed, a genuine sound of surprised delight. You're negotiating with me. You're negotiating with me, she countered. I simply want to ensure the terms are clear. Very well. First, agreed. I need a partner, not an ornament. You'll be involved in everything, to whatever degree you're comfortable. Second, agreed. You'll have an allowance and full access to the estate accounts. I want you to feel secure, not dependent. Third, he paused, I have no mistress, nor do I intend to take one. I've seen too much of the world to have any interest in such arrangements. If we marry in good faith. I'll expect the same fidelity from you. Even though you're not in love with me? Especially because I'm not in love with you. Love is a complication we can both do without. Respect, trust, partnership, these are the foundations that actually sustain a marriage. Everything else is theater. He had a point. Eliza had seen enough love matches turn sour to know that passion was no guarantee of happiness. And yet, what if you fall in love with someone else someday? She asked quietly. What then? Then we'll deal with it honestly, as partners should. But Miss Hartwell, I've lived 30 years without falling prey to that particular madness. I don't expect to start now." The cold logic of it should have reassured her. Instead, it made her oddly sad. Was this what life was? Negotiations and partnerships and careful management of expectations? But what was the alternative? Return to Ashford Manor and let Lady Ashford sell her to whatever gentleman offered the best price? "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. "We're meeting with my solicitor at 3 o'clock this afternoon to draw up the marriage contracts. If you agree, we'll obtain a special license and marry by the end of the week. If you refuse," he shrugged, "then I'll return to my original plan of remaining a bachelor and dealing with the social consequences." "That's hardly any time at all." "No," he agreed. "But I've found that the longer one deliberates over difficult choices, the more one finds reasons to avoid them entirely. Sometimes it's better to simply leap and trust that you'll find your footing on the way down." Eliza looked out at the Serpentine, at the gray water reflecting the gray sky. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sounds of the city waking, carriages, voices, the endless churn of London life. She thought of her mother, of the choices Sarah Hartwell had made for love that had led to poverty and an early death. She thought of Lady Ashford's cold calculations, of Celestine's cruel laughter, of the tiny, freezing room that had been her prison for the last 6 years. And she thought of the Duke's hand in hers last night, of the way he'd looked at her, as if she mattered. "Yes," she said. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you, on the terms we've discussed." She turned to face him, meeting those dark eyes directly. "But I have one more condition." "Name it." "Honesty. Complete honesty between us, always. If this is to be a partnership, then I need to know that you'll tell me the truth, even when it's difficult, even when you think I'd be better off not knowing. Can you promise me that?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he extended his hand. "I can promise to try. That's the best any of us can do." She placed her hand in his, and he drew her to her feet. They stood there on the banks of the Serpentine, two strangers about to bind their lives together, and Eliza felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a mantle. "Your Grace." "Julian," he interrupted. "If we're to be married, you might as well use my name." "Julian." She tested the name, feeling its shape on her tongue. "What happens now?" "Now," he said, tucking her hand into the crook of his elbow, "we go face your aunt and tell her that you won't be available for whatever scheme she's concocting. Then we'll visit my solicitor, arrange the settlements, and start planning a wedding. Does that sound acceptable?" "It sounds terrifying." "Good. The best decisions usually do." They walked together back toward the park gates, and Eliza tried not to think about how quickly her entire life had just changed. Yesterday, she'd been nobody. Today, she was going to be a duchess. It didn't feel real. None of it felt real. But real or not, there was no going back now. Lady Ashford's face went through several fascinating color changes when Julian announced their engagement. She started at red, progressed quickly to purple, and finally settled on an alarming shade of puce. "Engagement?" she sputtered. "But you can't possibly, she's nobody." "She's my betrothed," Julian corrected calmly. "And as such, I'll thank you to show her the respect her position demands. Now, Miss Hartwell will be removing her belongings from your home immediately. I trust you have no objection?" It wasn't really a question. Lady Ashford seemed to recognize this, because despite the fury radiating from every pore, she merely gave a tight nod. "Of course not, Your Grace, though I must say, this is highly irregular. The girl has no dowry, no connections, no—" "What she has," Julian interrupted, his voice dropping to a temperature that could freeze wine, "is my protection and my name." That is considerably more valuable than any dowry or connection you could possibly provide. Wouldn't you agree? Lady Ashford swallowed hard. Yes, Your Grace, of course. Excellent. Miss Hartwell, shall we collect your things? Eliza nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She led the way up to her tiny room, acutely aware of Julian following behind her, seeing the poverty in which she'd lived. He said nothing as she gathered her few possessions, a couple of threadbare dresses, her mother's jewelry box, a worn prayer book. It all fit into a single small trunk. "This is everything?" he asked quietly. "This is everything." Something flickered across his face. Anger? Pity? But he only nodded and lifted the trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Come, we have much to do before the day is out." They descended the stairs to find not only Lady Ashford waiting, but also Celestine and Margaret. Both girls were dressed in their finest day dresses, clearly prepared to receive callers, and both looked as if they'd been crying. "Eliza," Celestine said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "surely you're not really going through with this. You must know it's some kind of mistake." "There's no mistake," Julian said, before Eliza could respond. "Miss Hartwell has done me the great honor of accepting my proposal of marriage. We'll be wed by the end of the week." Margaret let out a small sob. "But that's not fair. Celestine is so much prettier, so much more accomplished." "Beauty and accomplishment," Julian said dryly, "are considerably less valuable than intelligence and integrity. Your cousin possesses the latter in abundance. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have an appointment with my solicitor." He ushered Eliza toward the door, where his carriage waited. It was a magnificent thing, all glossy black lacquer and gold trim, with a crest emblazoned on the door that Eliza didn't recognize. A footman helped her inside, and she found herself sinking into cushions so soft she thought she might disappear. Julian climbed in beside her, and the carriage lurched into motion. They rode in silence for several minutes. Eliza stared out the window at the passing streets, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 18 hours. "You should know," Julian said suddenly, "that Celestine is prettier than you." Eliza's head snapped around, hurt flashing through her. But he was smiling. Actually smiling, with genuine warmth in his eyes. "She's also vapid, cruel, and entirely without substance. You, Miss Hartwell, are beautiful in ways that matter, in ways that last. I hope you'll come to believe that someday." "I'm not beautiful," she said automatically. It was a truth she'd accepted long ago. Celestine and Margaret had made sure of that, with their constant comparisons and casual cruelties. "No," he agreed, and her heart sank until he continued. "You're not beautiful in the way society defines beauty. You're something better. You're striking. When you walked into that ballroom last night with your head held high despite your torn dress, despite the laughter, despite everything, that took my breath away. Not because of your features or your figure, but because of the strength it radiated. That's worth infinitely more than a pretty face." Eliza didn't know what to say to that. She turned back to the window, blinking rapidly against the sudden sting of tears. They arrived at the solicitor's office in Mayfair, a respectable building that spoke of old money and older principles. Inside, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles greeted them with barely concealed curiosity. "Your Grace," he said, bowing, "I received your message this morning. Most unusual circumstances." "Life is unusual, Mr. Pembroke. I find it keeps things interesting." Julian guided Eliza to a chair. "Miss Hartwell, this is Mr. Pembroke, who handles my legal affairs. Pembroke, this is my betrothed. We need a marriage settlement drawn up with all appropriate haste." For the next hour, Eliza listened as Julian outlined the terms of their agreement. A generous allowance for her personal use, full access to one of his country estates, provisions for any children they might have. It was more money than she'd ever imagined. casually discussed as if it were nothing. "And the matter we discussed earlier, Your Grace, Mr. Pembroke." Pembroke asked delicately, "The other business?" Julian glanced at Eliza. "Miss Hartwell is to have full access to all information regarding my business interests, both conventional and otherwise. She's to be trusted implicitly." The solicitor's eyebrows rose. "Are you quite certain? Some of those matters are delicate." "I'm certain. If she's to be my wife, then she needs to understand exactly what she's agreeing to." After Mr. Pembroke left to draft the contracts, Julian turned to Eliza with a serious expression. "I need to tell you something that will likely make you reconsider this entire arrangement." Her stomach dropped. "What is it?" He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street below. "I told you I spent 5 years abroad. That was true. What I didn't tell you was why I left England in the first place, or what I've been doing all this time." "I'm listening." 5 years ago, I was engaged to be married. Lady Catherine Ashworth, daughter of the Earl of Bromley. She was everything society expected. Beautiful, accomplished, perfectly bred for the role of Duchess. I thought I loved her. He paused, his hands clenched behind his back. 2 weeks before the wedding, I discovered that she'd been having an affair with my best friend, a man I'd known since childhood, whom I trusted completely. I'm sorry. Don't be. It wasn't love that drove me mad. It was the betrayal, the calculated nature of it. They'd been carrying on for over a year, right under my nose, and the entire ton knew. Everyone knew, and they'd all kept quiet because it was amusing to watch the arrogant Duke be made a fool. His voice was flat, emotionless, but Eliza could hear the old pain beneath the words. I challenged my former friend to a duel. Illegal, of course, but I was past caring about legality. We met at dawn in Hyde Park, and He stopped, took a breath. I killed him. Not cleanly, not quickly. He died slowly, and I watched.
And when it was over, I realized that I'd become the very thing I despised, someone who destroyed others without thought or mercy. Eliza sat very still, processing this confession. So I left England. I went to the continent, then further east. I worked as a translator, a courier, sometimes as a spy for various interests. I saw the worst of humanity. War, slavery, casual cruelty on a scale that made London's social games look like child's play. And slowly, I rebuilt myself into someone who could live with what I'd done, someone who could be useful rather than simply destructive. He turned back to face her. "But that's who you'd be marrying, Miss Hartwell. A man who killed his friend in a fit of rage. A man who spent 5 years in the shadows, doing things that would horrify polite society. A man who's irredeemably stained by blood and darkness. So if you want to walk away, I'll understand. I'll make sure Lady Ashford can't touch you, find you some respectable position where you'll be safe. But I won't hold you to our agreement, not after knowing this." Eliza stood and crossed to where he waited by the window. She looked up into those dark, haunted eyes and saw the truth written there, the guilt, the self-loathing, the desperate hope that she might not turn away. "Did you love her?" she asked, quietly. "Lady Catherine?" "I thought I did. Looking back, I think I loved the idea of her more than the reality. She was who I was supposed to want. And your friend? I loved him like a brother. That betrayal cut deeper than hers ever could." Eliza nodded slowly, thinking. "You killed him. That was wrong. The law was wrong to force you into such a position, and you were wrong to accept the challenge. But you didn't kill him because you enjoyed it or because you wanted to hurt him. You killed him because you were hurt and angry and betrayed, and you made a terrible choice in a moment of passion. That doesn't excuse it." "No," she agreed, "but it does explain it." "And more importantly, you've spent 5 years trying to atone for it.
You could have hidden in your estates, drinking yourself to death or wallowing in self-pity. Instead, you went out into the world and tried to do something useful. That suggests you're capable of change, of growth. That's more than most people manage. He stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. You're not horrified? I'm saddened. I'm sorry you had to experience such betrayal, and I'm sorry you carry that guilt. But horrified? No. She took his hand, feeling it tremble slightly under her touch. Julian, I've lived 6 years in a house where cruelty is casual and kindness is considered weakness. I've watched my cousins destroy people's reputations for amusement, seen Lady Ashford ruin servants' lives over minor infractions. You killed a man who betrayed you, and you've spent 5 years trying to make amends. They destroy people every day and sleep soundly. Who should I fear more? Something broke in his expression, a wall crumpling, a mask slipping. He pulled her close, not romantically, but desperately, as if she were an anchor in a storm. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "Thank you for not turning away." They stood there in the solicitor's office, 2 damaged souls finding unexpected refuge in each other, and Eliza felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't love, not yet, maybe not ever, but it was something, some connection that felt more real than anything she'd experienced in years. "We're going to be all right," she said, surprised to find she believed it. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together. That's what partners do." He pulled back enough to look at her, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw him smile without shadows. "Yes," he said, "that's what partners do." The wedding took place 4 days later in a small chapel in Mayfair, witnessed only by Mr. Pembroke and Betty, whom Julian had insisted on inviting, despite Lady Ashford's protests. There were no flowers, no elaborate gown, no celebration. Just 2 people speaking vows to each other in quiet voices, binding their lives together with solemn promises. Eliza wore a new dress that Julian had commissioned, simple but elegant ivory silk that actually fit her properly. When she'd protested the expense, he'd merely raised an eyebrow and said, "You're to be a duchess. You'll need more than threadbare cotton." As they stood before the minister, Eliza studied Julian's profile. In the soft light filtering through the stained glass, he looked younger, less burdened. When he turned to her and slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band, his hands were steady. "I, Julian Alexander Ravencross, take thee, Eliza Marie Hartwell." The words washed over her like a benediction. This was really happening. In moments, she would be a duchess, would have a home, would have protection and safety, and a partner who'd chosen her not despite her flaws, but because of her strength. When it was her turn, she spoke the vows clearly, meaning every word. She might not love him, not yet, but she respected him, trusted him. That was enough to build on. "I now pronounce you man and wife." Julian kissed her chastely, a brush of lips that was more formality than passion. But his eyes held promise, not of romance, but of partnership, of shared purpose. They signed the register with Betty weeping happily in the background and Mr. Pembroke looking professionally satisfied. And then it was done. She was Eliza Ravencross, Duchess of Ravencross. The girl who'd been laughed at in a torn dress was now one of the most powerful women in England. The irony was not lost on her. Julian's townhouse was in Berkeley Square, a massive Georgian edifice that made Ashford Manor look like a cottage. As the carriage pulled up, Eliza felt a flutter of nerves. This was to be her home now. These servants, these rooms, this life, all of it hers. The staff was lined up in the entrance hall to meet their new mistress. Eliza counted 24 people, all wearing immaculate livery, all staring at her with barely concealed curiosity. "Everyone," Julian said, his hand at the small of her back, "this is Her Grace, the Duchess of Ravencross. She is to be obeyed in all things and treated with the utmost respect. Mrs. Winters, will you show her to her chambers?" The housekeeper, a tall woman with iron-gray hair and kind eyes, curtsied. "Of course, Your Grace, if you'll follow me." Eliza glanced at Julian, who nodded encouragingly. She followed Mrs. Winters up the grand staircase, trying not to gape at the opulence surrounding her. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, artwork that must be worth fortunes. It was a world away from the drafty servants' quarters she'd left behind. Her rooms were a suite of 3 chambers, a bedroom, a sitting room, and a dressing room, all decorated in shades of blue and cream. A fire crackled in the hearth, and fresh flowers stood in vases on the mantel. "His Grace's chambers are through that door," Mrs. Winters said, gesturing to a connecting door. "Though, of course, you may come and go as you please. Dinner is served at 8 in the formal dining room, but His Grace said to inform you that tonight you may take a tray in your rooms if you prefer, given the trying day you've had." "Thank you, Mrs. Winters. That's very thoughtful." The housekeeper smiled. "If I may say so, Your Grace, the staff is very pleased to have a mistress of the house again. Ravencross House has been too quiet these past years. It will be good to have life in it once more." After she left, Eliza sank onto the edge of the enormous bed and let out a long breath. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. She was married to a duke, living in a house that probably had more rooms than she could count, with servants to attend her and more money than she could spend in a lifetime. And she'd never felt more alone. A knock at the connecting door startled her. "Come in," she called. Julian entered, still wearing his wedding clothes. He'd loosened his cravat slightly, making him look almost relaxed. "I wanted to make sure you were settling in. Mrs. Winters can be overwhelming on first acquaintance." "She seems lovely." "She is. She practically raised me after my mother died. If you ever need anything at all, she's the one to ask." He crossed to the window, looking out at the square below. "I know this is all very sudden and overwhelming. I want you to know that there's no pressure that is to say, the connecting door locks from your side. This marriage doesn't have to be." "Consummated?" Eliza supplied when he trailed off. He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Quite. I meant what I said about this being a partnership. Physical intimacy can be part of that if you wish, but it's not required. We married for practical reasons, not romantic ones." "Thank you for saying so. Though I confess, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around the fact that I'm married at all, let alone to a duke." He smiled. "I'm still trying to wrap my mind around the fact that I'm married to someone who negotiated her own marriage settlements. Most women would have simply agreed to whatever terms were offered. Most women haven't lived as I have. Dependence makes you vulnerable. I needed to ensure I'd have some measure of security, regardless of how our marriage fared." "Clever girl." He said it with genuine admiration. "Speaking of which, there's something I need to show you. Something that will explain what I meant about my business interests." Eliza stood. "Now?" "Now. Before you settle in too comfortably, before you start to think this is simply going to be a life of balls and social calls, you need to understand what you've agreed to." She followed him back down the stairs, but instead of going to the main floor, he led her to a corridor that terminated in a heavy oak door. He produced a key and unlocked it, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. "Should I be worried?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. "Probably, but you married me anyway, so your judgment is clearly questionable." There was humor in his voice, but also tension. "The truth is, Eliza, I haven't been entirely forthcoming about what I do. Or rather, I've been truthful, but not complete. What I'm about to show you, it may change your opinion of me, it may frighten you, but I promised you honesty, and this is the heart of that promise." He lit a lamp and started down the stairs. After a moment's hesitation, Eliza followed. The stairs descended far deeper than she'd expected, until she was certain they must be well below street level. The air grew cooler, and she could smell ink and paper and something else, something sharp and chemical. At the bottom was another door, this one reinforced with iron. Julian unlocked it and ushered her inside. Eliza stopped, staring in amazement. The room was enormous, clearly taking up most of the space beneath the house. One wall was lined with filing cabinets, each drawer carefully labeled. Another held a massive map of Europe and the Near East, covered in pins and notations. A third wall was dominated by what appeared to be a complex system of tubes and pulleys, some kind of pneumatic messaging system, she realized, like the ones used in large department stores, but far more elaborate. In the center of the room was a large table covered in documents, photographs, and what looked like coded messages. "Welcome," Julian said quietly, "to the real reason I returned to England. This is the headquarters of, well, we don't have an official name. Unofficially, we're sometimes called the Ravens Network. We gather information on threats to British interests abroad, human trafficking rings, weapons smugglers, slavers, corrupt officials who prey on the vulnerable. And then we act on that information."
How? Sometimes we simply pass intelligence to the authorities. Sometimes we intervene more directly. It depends on the situation and the urgency of the threat. Eliza moved closer to the table, studying the documents. She recognized several languages: French, German, what might be Russian. "You're spies." "We're independent contractors who sometimes work with various intelligence services, yes, though spy makes it sound more glamorous than it is. Mostly it's paperwork, analysis, and careful planning." She picked up a photograph showing a man in military dress. There was a red X marked through his face. "And sometimes it's more than planning." Julian's expression darkened. "Sometimes, when necessary, when lives are at stake." "Have you killed since returning to England?" "No, but I would if I had to, if someone was in immediate danger and there was no other option." He met her eyes steadily. "I won't lie to you about this, Eliza. This work can be dangerous. It's the reason I wanted a wife who could be trusted, who could be part of this, rather than simply an ornament upstairs who knew nothing of what I really do. But it's also the reason I understand if you want to walk away." Eliza studied the room, her mind working through implications. "This is why you need me to be intelligent and discreet. You want me to help with this. I want you to be my partner in this, yes. Not in the field, I'm not asking you to put yourself in physical danger, but in the analysis, the planning, the coordination. You have skills that would be invaluable. You notice things others don't. You understand how to navigate social situations, how to read people. You want me to gather intelligence at balls and social calls. I want you to help me save lives. The rest is just details." She should have been frightened, should have demanded he take her back upstairs, should have found some way to annul the marriage and escape this madness.
Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. "Tell me about your current operation," she said. Julian's face broke into a genuine smile. "Are you certain? Once you know, you can't unknow. You'll be complicit in everything we do." "I'm already complicit by virtue of being your wife. I'd rather be an informed accomplice than an ignorant one." "Very well." He moved to the map and pointed to a location in Constantinople. "We have intelligence that suggests a slave trading ring operating out of this location. They target young women from poor families, promising them work as governesses or ladies' maids, then sell them to wealthy men throughout the Ottoman Empire." "How many women?" "Last year alone, over 300 that we know of, but the network is large and well protected. We've been tracking it for 2 years, trying to identify all the key players so we can shut it down completely, rather than just arresting the street-level operators. And what's your plan? Over the next hour, Julian laid out the operation in detail. It was complex, involving agents in multiple countries, coded messages, bribes, and carefully orchestrated raids. Eliza listened, occasionally asking questions, her respect for what he'd built growing with each revelation. The problem, he concluded, is that we believe there's a British component to the network. Someone here in London who acts as a coordinator, arranging for the girls to be recruited and shipped east. But we haven't been able to identify them. They're too careful, too well-connected. So you need to infiltrate London society, see who might be involved. Precisely. And I can't do that alone. A bachelor duke arouses suspicion if he shows too much interest in young women's employment opportunities. But a married couple, concerned about social welfare, asking questions about poor girls seeking positions, he trailed off meaningfully. Eliza nodded slowly. We could make inquiries without attracting attention. Visit workhouses, talk to employment agencies, attend charity events where such matters might be discussed. Exactly. And in the meantime, you'd be meeting the key players in society, learning who's who, building connections that might prove useful, all while appearing to be nothing more than a new duchess finding her footing in the ton. It was clever. It was dangerous. It was the first time anyone had ever asked Eliza to be part of something important. I'm in, she said. Julian crossed to her and took both her hands in his. You're sure? This isn't a game, Eliza. If we're caught, if our involvement becomes known, we'll be destroyed. The scandal would be unimaginable. I've already been destroyed once, she said quietly. I survived. And this time, I'd be destroyed for doing something meaningful rather than simply existing in a torn dress. I'll take that trade. He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. It wasn't romantic, but it was intimate in a different way. A joining of purpose, of commitment to a shared cause. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for being brave enough to do this. Thank you, she replied, for thinking I could. They stood there in the underground room, surrounded by maps and documents and the evidence of Julian's secret war against cruelty. And Eliza felt something settle in her chest. She might not love him yet, but she believed in him, believed in what he was trying to do. That was enough to build on. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity. By day, Eliza was introduced to society as the new Duchess of Ravencross, enduring countless morning calls, afternoon teas, and evening entertainments. By night, she descended into the underground room and studied maps, learned codes, memorized faces and names of suspected criminals. She discovered that she had a talent for this work. Her years of being overlooked had taught her to observe, to listen, to notice the details others missed. At a charity ball for orphans, she noticed a woman who seemed too interested in which girls were without family connections. At a garden party, she overheard a conversation about employment opportunities abroad that sounded suspiciously like recruitment for the trafficking ring. She reported everything to Julian, who verified her suspicions through his network of agents. Slowly, they were building a picture of the London operation. But it wasn't all work. Julian proved to be surprisingly good company, with a dry wit and a gift for finding humor in the absurdities of high society. They fell into an easy partnership, dining together most evenings and discussing everything from current operations to philosophy to the ridiculous fashions of the season. One evening, about 3 weeks after their wedding, they were reviewing the latest intelligence when Julian suddenly looked up from his papers. I should warn you, he said. Lady Catherine Ashworth, my former fiancée, has returned to London. She'll likely be at the Pemberton Ball tomorrow night. Eliza felt a small twist of anxiety. Do you want to avoid the ball? No, avoiding her would only give her power over us, but I wanted you to be prepared. She can be difficult. Difficult how? Julian sighed. Vindictive. When I left England, she spread rumors that I'd been cruel to her, that I'd broken her heart. Never mind that she'd been unfaithful. The Ton loves a tragic heroine, and she played the role to perfection. I see. And what does she want now? Probably to reassert her dominance, to show that she's still important, still relevant, to prove that I made a mistake in not forgiving her. He reached across the table and took Eliza's hand. I need you to know that whatever she says or does tomorrow night, I don't regret our marriage, not for a moment. The words warmed her more than they should have. This was a marriage of convenience, she reminded herself, a partnership, nothing more. But when had Julian's smile started making her heart skip? When had his good opinion started mattering so much? She pushed the thoughts aside. This was dangerous territory, developing feelings for a man who'd made clear he had no interest in love. "I'll be fine," she said, extracting her hand gently. "I faced down crueler people than a jilted lover." But the next evening, as they prepared for the Pemberton ball, Eliza found herself more nervous than she'd expected. She dressed carefully in a gown of deep emerald green that Julian's modiste had created, with her hair arranged in an elaborate style that had taken her new lady's maid an hour to perfect. When she descended to the drawing room where Julian waited, his expression stopped her on the stairs. He was staring at her with something like wonder. "You," he trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. "Stunning. Absolutely stunning."